Everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
Welcome back to 650 CL's Talk About Strata. And I have in the studio with me Veronica Franco from Clark Wilson. She's a lawyer who specializes in strata. And Shannon Salter, who is the chair of the Civil Resolution Tribunal. And we've just been talking, Veronica, about this scenario where the strata is in a situation where they have an owner who just simply doesn't want to comply with the number of pets that are allowed in the building. So the strata has no choice but to just wander down the road of enforcement, which is pretty much going to be a costly Supreme Court application.
That's right. It's not easy for anybody, and it's very expensive. So,
well, and it hinges on, because it requires a 3/4 vote of the Strata Corporation, that even though the Strata Council wants to enforce the bylaw, the owners may not approve it.
yeah. And that often happens, I think, with the most controversial bylaws, pets being one of them,
Right.
where there may very well be a big enough faction that actually wants
More dogs.
and then coupled with a faction that doesn't want to pay for anything.
Right.
So that's just enough to defeat the resolution to enforce the bylaws.
They're pretty much doomed.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but that does open a door on another issue in the fact that the Strata Corporation can still be compelled to enforce a bylaw, which is one of the little complications we have with the tribunal right now, Shannon. You know, the Strata Corporation can't get the resolution to enforce the bylaw, but an owner, once the way it stands now with the tribunal, once it comes into effect, an owner will be able to make an application to the tribunal that essentially will be requesting that the Strata be ordered to enforce the bylaw, which essentially through the back door would order the Strata Corporation into some kind of compliance application through Supreme Court.
Yeah, and it is the case that at least for now, the CRT is voluntary for strata owners and really anybody in the public.
Right.
People can choose to use the existing court system or the CRT for the first year or so of its operation. As I said earlier, I think there are some problems as a result of that, or issues that will have to be worked out. And you've identified one of them where you could potentially have some inequalities that could result from that. Although I should say that, people's fundamental rights aren't altered by this, but
Yes.
certainly the way that they might go about enforcing them, by reducing barriers to entry, you might create a slightly uneven playing field that way. I think this is one of the reasons why is likely in the coming years that the CRT will be made mandatory, the mandatory forum for both strata owners and tenants and strata corporations. But in the meantime, that's an issue that we're going to have to look at and try and work out.
It'll be an evolution,
Yes.
right?
As with all new things.
As with all new things, it'll be an evolution. It'll be a test for everyone involved. So, Veronica, you mentioned that, with complicated bylaws or controversial bylaws. So I picked out all the emails that we got about controversial and complicated
Of course you
bylaws.
did.
Because, well, they're the best ones.
They're the most fun.
They're the things that people really want to hear about. Eventually, though, on the pet bylaw, if you get the court order, what could be the result?
The pet could go. The court would order that the pet has to be gone, and so the owner would have to remove the pet, find a new home for their pet, or that owner would have the choice of moving with the pet, because we know some people are quite attached to their pets and will leave if their pet has to go. But it's quite possible the court has made a number of orders in general where they require the enforcement, where they require compliance with the bylaws,
Right.
and that does include pet removals. People removal, too.
People removal, restoring property back to its original
That's
condition, modification of behavior patterns, those types of things.
Yes.
Well, and Shannon, you say, at this point, it's going to be voluntary for owners, but think about a dispute that would end up in Supreme Court in any case, that will cost both of the parties significant amounts of money. We have a perfectly good voluntary dispute resolution process that will cost a couple $100 and still find a solution. It would seem logical for people that would just want to resolve this as quickly and as inexpensively as possible anyhow.
And I think that's the common sense approach to this. If you know that your options are pay now or pay later, in the sense of the time and effort in resolving your dispute, if you were making that decision rationally, you'd say, well, with the CRT process, I'll be able to do this in a couple of months for a couple of $100s. But if I decide, because it's voluntary, that I don't want to participate, it's not like you get away scot-free.
Right.
You're still going to have to face the music, but this time it's going to be, as you said, Veronica, much more expensive, much more time consuming. So even though the CRT is voluntary, I think the fact that there's a bit of a carrot and stick approach to this, right? If you're not willing to use the CRT, you're going to have to use this other forum. The problem's not going away. You may just have to pay more and take a lot more of your energy and time to resolve the issue. So hopefully that will persuade people to consent to using the CRT.
Well, and if you think about it, strata corporations, if they want to bring a procedure in, if the owner doesn't volunteer and decides, well, no, I don't want to participate, and the strata corporation says, well, fine, we're going to go to Supreme Court, all of the owners share that expense. Whereas the individual owner, while they could try to go self-representation, most of them don't, because it's difficult. The rules, while they have been updated, are still difficult to follow, and they still want assistance from a lawyer. So they have now taken themselves out of a $200 forum into one that is now tens of thousands of dollars, which they are funding on their own, unlike the Strata Corporation, which is sharing the costs amongst all the other owners.
Not to mention, of course, that if they're unsuccessful at Supreme Court, they have the potential of having a cost award against them.
That's right.
Where they would not only pay their own legal expenses and court fees, but also potentially some portion of the stratas as well.
Correct,
so, in small claims court and in the tribunal, you don't have the same kind of cost consequences. So the CRT is able to order one party to pay the filing fees of another party if that party is successful, but those fees are quite modest. And the CRT can also order the reimbursement of other reasonable expenses that are associated with the proceeding. But here we're talking about ones that on average are going to be significantly less expensive than a similar claim at the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
So hundreds of dollars versus tens of thousands of dollars.
That's
likely.
Right.
That's usually the scale you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting. So, common sense, practical application. So just one other thing, though, about the voluntary side. If once we've consented, so, where I live in the strata has come to me, we have a dispute, the strata says we'd like to solve it. I agree that we'll use the CRT. Once we've consented, that now becomes a binding enforceable agreement once a decision is made, doesn't it?
That's right. So if you as an owner and the Strata Corporation were able to reach an agreement at the facilitation stage, the facilitator could ask a tribunal member to turn that agreement into an order of the tribunal. And what that means is that you could go to court and enforce that as a court order.
Right.
You wouldn't have to sue on an agreement, which often happens if people just reach an agreement on their own.
Yes.
And by the same token, if the matter went to adjudication and the tribunal made a decision, the result of that, the decision would be enforceable as a court order as well.
Yeah, interesting. So it's going to be quite a significant transformation in how we see justice in the province.
That's my hope.
Well, how about another email?
Sure. Sounds like fun.
So we go from pets, because we know pets are the source of so many issues for strata corporations. And what about age restrictions? So we have a strata that has an age restriction that limits occupancy of strata lots to all residents who are 19 years of age and over. They have a young couple who purchased a unit, moved in a year after the bylaw was passed and filed in land titles, and they're expecting a child on November 15th. So that's like next week or something like that, right?
That's right.
They've been telling the strata that because they live in the building, that they're exempt from the bylaw because of family status, and they'll not be required to sell or move. So, I guess the first question, Veronica, is what about the enforceability of age restriction bylaws? How do they work for strata corporations?
Well, strata corporations have a specific provision under the Strata Property Act that says that a strata corporation has the power to create an age restriction bylaw. And the Human Rights Code recognizes that right in the Human Rights Code, that says if the legislation says that you are allowed to discriminate on the basis of age, then they are exempt from the consequences of the Human Rights Code with respect to normal age discrimination. So in general, strata corporations can have any kind of age restriction bylaw at this point in time.
So enforceable. So they
Absolutely.
So they have the baby. They come home. And now their Strata is going to probably get a complaint because probably the first night the baby cries all night, the neighbors will complain.
That's right.
And what's the Strata's ability now? It's really no different than the pet relationship
Absolutely.
with respect to bylaw enforcement.
So they have to comply with Section 135 of the Act and go through that whole letter writing procedure before they can enforce, before they can levy a fine. But once they've gone through that process, they can levy a fine. Again, this is a continuing contravention kind of scenario, so they'd be able to levy a fine every 7 days. And similar situation could arise. You could have an owner that says, yeah, this isn't worth it. We'll sell and we'll move, or we'll rent and we'll move. But some owners will say, no, we're prepared to pay $200 a week to stay here until we're good and ready to move. In which case, again, the fines start to accumulate and the Strata Corporation has to decide, well, we have to do something to enforce these bylaws. This isn't good enough. And as I mentioned before, the courts have said it's not good enough for you to just let the fines accumulate. So again, you're back to the scenario of going to the owners and saying, we're going to need more than $10,000, or let's say $20,000, to bring a court application to get an injunction to force the baby out, so to speak.
Right.
And then you're at the whim of the owners who may or may not want the baby out, so to speak.
Right.
And then again, you're back to going to court, spending tens of thousands of dollars in this really acrimonious kind of scenario.
So, but this is kind of like game on for Strata corporations now. Like the whole dynamics of Strata councils over the coming year, as we start to see the tribunal come into effect, is going to change. Because all of a sudden, Strata councils who have kind of fudged the rules, not necessarily enforced bylaws, knowing they could get away with it because owners would have to go to Supreme Court to enforce that, the rules are going to change because disputes with Strata corporations are going to be mandatory. So you know, I could see quite a significant change, Shannon, as we start moving into the enforcement or the compliance of Strata corporations.
Yeah, and that's I think that one of the fascinating things about the justice system is that on one hand you have the laws and the rules and the regulations, and in the case of the Strata, the bylaws, but the unseen hidden player there is the procedure that you have to use to enforce those rules and laws and bylaws. And that, the procedure, can have such a great influence on the way that the laws are applied, and how are they applied equally, and how do we make them accessible or not. And what we're talking about is making it more accessible for the time being, especially for owners or tenants, and that is going to really affect behavior by Strata corporations.
So we've gone for 50 years without Strata police. But in a default sort of way, we're really, by having the tribunal come into effect and by Strata corporations being compelled into the disputes, we actually really now have a default police force for Strata corporations once the tribunal comes into effect.
Yeah, and you know, I wouldn't characterize them as a police force, but I would say that
it's an enforcement body.
It's an enforcement body. It's a way a means by which people can seek a remedy for their rights. They have certain rights as members of a strata or as a strata corporation, and you're providing them with a way to obtain a remedy for those rights. And we know that rights are only as good as the remedies by which you can use to give effect to them.
So we'll have to be hunting around for a little badge that says Sheriff Shannon on it.
You will not find one.
But I mean, it's a great point you raise. I don't know how many strata corporations they don't follow Section 135 correctly, despite the fact that we've got good case law that explains exactly what the procedure is. And then they expect that the bylaws are going to be paid, or expect the bylaw fines to be paid. But now, and the owner will, you know, scream at the top of their lungs, you're not enforcing these bylaws or levying these fines in compliance with the Act. And they didn't really have a remedy other than going to Supreme Court. They couldn't even go to small claims court to get that waived. So now they'll be able to go to the CRT and have an order that says, well, we're going to throw out your fines because you didn't comply with Section 135.
Interesting times ahead for Strata corporations and owners. I'm Tony Giaventu. This is 650 CI. Talk about Strata. If you have any questions for us, or you'd like to have some matter addressed on air, you can email us at questions@talkaboutstrata.com. questions@talkaboutstrata.com, and we're going to be right back with a few more emails and scenarios.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call on CL 650.